So today what we're going to look at is the David Myers 8th edition psychology textbook. We're looking at chapter 11, intelligence. This is going to be part 1. So when we look at intelligence, remember here's just an outline of what the unit, what the chapter covers. So when we look at intelligence, we have a couple questions that we try and ask. Is intelligence actually something inborn? Is there some sort of inborn general capacity? This is our intelligence. Do we have it? And if we do have it, is there some sort of number that we can actually give to this intelligence score to make it actually meaningful? You know, how can we interpret this intelligence? So intelligence in all our cultures is the ability to learn from experience, solve problems, and use our knowledge to adapt to new situations. Now, if we can do all this stuff, what we normally test when we look at intelligence in our research study is school smarts. The reason why is school smarts is typically kind of the easier way to test something. So we test like in a course testing, or even the AP exams themselves, they're kind of school smarts test. Conceptual difficulties. So we look at intelligence being a concept and not really a thing. And so a concept is pretty broad. And so you're going to have a lot of different interpretations of what intelligence is. So when we think of intelligence as a trait, a thing, we make an error. Okay, you know, like we need to think of it more as this broad conceptual thing. And we need to look at it in that manner. Intelligence is more abstract than it is kind of a factual thing. So when we look at controversies about intelligence, you know, is intelligence a single overall ability, or is there several specific kinds of abilities when we look at intelligence? With modern neuroscience techniques, can we locate and measure intelligence within the brain? So these are things that we're going to kind of look at, and what the leading researchers in this field actually look at still today. So ability are abilities. Have you ever thought that since people's mental abilities are so diverse, it may be justifiable to label those abilities with only one word, intelligence, you know? This is where we get like that multiple intelligence or just intelligence. It's a debate that still goes on. So you may speculate that diverse abilities represent different kinds of intelligence. But the big question is, how do you test these different kinds of intelligences? So Spearman comes out with this general intelligence. So Spearman is a psychologist, and what he looked at was, he said that there was this general intelligence represented by the little g, and it helped, what he looked at was factor analysis approach in your statistics. So this guy right here, he's an athletic, and athleticism, in his opinion, and Spearman's opinion, is an intelligence like many other things. So he would look at what you're good at, and then that would be like a general intelligence. So where you have a general intelligence. So he proposed that this general intelligence is linked to many clusters, and when you cluster things, you can analyze them by factor analysis. So here's your example. People who do well on vocab examinations, they do well typically on paragraph comprehension exams, and why is because in Spearman's theory, this would be defining a person as a verbal intelligence because it's the cluster. Now, you can have other things in there too. You can have like spatial abilities, or you can have reasoning ability factors. So when you ever look at like the SAT or the ACT, they ask you all kinds of different questions, and then they group it into one category. That's kind of like a general intelligence. So you have to do, on the SAT, you have to read paragraphs, you have to make comparisons and do some vocab stuff, but all of that is testing your verbal ability. So Thurstone didn't like Spearman, and so he analyzed his subjects not on a single scale of general intelligence, but on these 7 clusters. And when he looked at these 7 clusters, here's the stuff he kind of looked at. He looked at word fluency, verbal comprehension, spatial ability, perceptual speed, numerical ability, inductive reasoning, and memory. So he looks at a wider scope of things, whereas Spearman is going to look, he looks at everything, and Thurstone kind of like narrows it down to these 7. So he looks at all these nice, wonderful things. So you can see some of this is more English related, then you'll get stuff more mathematically related, and then like with inductive reasoning and memory, that's your ability to reason quickly. So general intelligence, later psychologists analyzed Thurstone's data, and they found a weak relationship between these clusters, suggesting some evidence of a G factor. So Thurstone's work by some psychologists, if the AP exams wanting you to look at criticism of it, is that the data doesn't support Thurstone's belief in these 7 clusters, whereas the data seems to suggest more of this general intelligence by Spearman. Now we get more people into this intelligence factors. One of the more recent guys is Howard Gardner, and Gardner comes up with multiple intelligence, and he says that what you're really good at is normally what your intelligence is going to be. So Gardner notes that brain damage may distinguish, it may diminish, one type of ability, but not others. So like our people with the savants here. Our savant, remember what a savant is someone who's technically mentally retarded. So they're technically in the MR category. Their IQ is below 70, but they have these wonderful abilities in certain things, like being able to sculpt something, being able to read. This is Kim Peeks here, how he reads different, being able to play musical instruments. So they're savants because they can excel in certain things, but not necessarily in everything. So people with savant syndrome, they excel in abilities unrelated to general intelligence. So Gardner has these 8 types of intelligences, and he did kind of do a 9th one. But when you look at his intelligences, a lot of school systems have gone to Gardner's belief in these 8 intelligence. So a linguistic person would be like a verbal person. Logical mathematic would be someone who's good in like math and science fields. Musical, someone that's a rhythmic learner. Spatial would be your visual learner. Bodily kinesthetic is someone that needs to do hands-on stuff, move around. Intrapersonal is someone who likes to reflect on their work. They like to think within. They normally like to work by themselves. It doesn't mean that they can't work with other people. It's just that they do their best work on their own. Interpersonal, they're team builders. They like to work with groups of people. And naturalistic learners are the people who are like getting out there in nature. The existential intelligence is something that he come up with a little bit later. This is the ability to think about the question of life, death, and existence. Gardner's got all kinds of critics, and one of the big criticisms of Gardner is some of these intelligences have got to be more important than others, like having linguistic abilities and being able to do the interpersonal working with a team would be more beneficial to you than maybe being a naturalistic learner. So modern day critics of Gardner, one of the big things that they criticize is the fact that maybe naturalistic learning isn't as important as someone who is a linguistic or a logical mathematical learner. Now Sternberg, he agrees with Gardner that there are multiple intelligences, but instead of 8 like Gardner has got, he only looks at 3. So he looks at analytical, creative, and practical. Analytical intelligence is being assessed by some sort of intelligence test. You can test this. Creative intelligence is a little bit harder because creative intelligence is where you can actually come up with novel, new situations and new solutions to problems. So they're brand new, creative. This would be like people who are really good at art or music. It would more be like your creative field or your creative intelligence. Now the next one is the practical intelligence, and practical intelligence is like street smarts. This is like your day-to-day tasks. So he looks at these 3, and you probably are going to have one that's a little bit more dominant, but that's where the intelligence tests kind of come in, is that normally we do have some field, if you believe in these multiple intelligences, that is a little bit more dominant for us. Like some of you did really, really well on the SAT because maybe you're an analytical, intelligent person, but tests like that, they don't do real well with you. Maybe you're more of a creative intelligence person, where if I gave you a blank canvas, you could paint a wonderful picture, or you could take a masterpiece, amazing artwork, and analyze it. And that's a creative intelligence. You could come up with all kinds of stuff with it. And practical intelligence, like that everyday stuff, how do you test that? That's the issue with some of these intelligence theories. So this is a pretty good chart on comparing all of them, their strengths, and then other things that you need to consider with this. So one of the things about intelligence is you need to make certain you know the good parts of it and, of course, the bad parts. Emotional intelligence, EI, is something that they've come out with recently, and this is emotional intelligence is your ability to perceive, understand, and use emotions appropriately. The test of overall, or the test of emotional intelligence, is going to look at how well you adapt to situations, your emotions. Are you stable? So component and description. Perceive emotion. Can you actually recognize people's emotions? Can you recognize their faces, music, stories? Understanding emotion. Can you predict emotions, how they change and how they blend? Can you manage emotions? Expressing emotions in different situations, and use emotion appropriately. So utilize your emotions to adapt and be creative in situations. So EI is something new, and there's a lot of criticisms to it. A lot of people don't think it's really that important. But if you want to be a pretty good leader, you do kind of need to know who and you need to know the feel of the room, what people are feeling, who's going to accept the news a little bit easier than other people. So Gardner and others criticize the idea of emotional intelligence, and they question whether we're stretching intelligence way too far. And we'll look more at like emotion with chapter 13 on emotions. So intelligence and creativity. Creativity is the ability to produce ideas that are both novel and valuable, and it correlates somewhat with intelligence. So when we look at creativity, typically people who are pretty creative, there's an expertise in the area. They have a pretty good knowledge base to build from. They are imaginative thinkers, so they can see things in different ways. They have an adventuresome personality, which means they're willing to take a risk. They have intrinsic motivation, which means that they are doing something for the pleasure of doing it. They don't need necessarily any external reward. And a creative environment. They need an environment that lets them thrive and lets them take the risk that's going to come up with this new novel solution to your problem. Creativity is really hard for people to have, and this is something that the business world really wants schools for young people to start adapting to and start having more of. So this is why some teachers won't show you what they want the final project to look like, because if we show you guys what the final project is going to look like, what we've noticed is you guys will copy it. And there was a study done ages ago in college where they let the kids look at a collage. One class, they showed what the collage should look like at the end. Here's an example of what a collage looks like, and people just copied it, right? The other class, they didn't show what an example of a collage looked like, and the people in that class had more creative projects than the people who were actually shown what they thought, what the professors thought the final project would be. So when you don't set up barriers, people tend to be more creative than when you set up those restrictive barriers. So is intelligence neurologically measurable? So recent studies indicate some correlation between brain size and intelligence. As brain size decreases with age, scores on verbal tests also decrease. So what we see is that, and if you look at the animal world, the larger the brain, the more intelligent the individual or the animal will be. So brain function. Studies of brain function show that people who score high on intelligence tests perceive stimuli faster, retrieve information from memory quicker, and show faster brain response times. So people who tend to do well on these intelligence tests, they're people who actually respond quick to things. So they just function at a little bit faster pace than other people. So assessing intelligence. Psychologists define intelligence testing as a method for assessing an individual's mental aptitude and comparing them with things like numbers. Numbers is something that we can understand. So Binet is a guy who is going to come up with a test, and he comes up with an intelligence test for Paris because Paris had mandated that all children go to school. And one of the things that he noticed that when kids were coming into school, there was a difference. The poor children were not at the same mental ability as the richer kids, or the kids who come from a wealthier background, a fluent background. So what he wanted to do is he wanted to come out with an intelligence test to test where children were and to bring the kids up. So if you were a kid who wasn't performing at grade level or at age level, then this test would allow the school system to make sure that you got the extra work or the extra time in to bring you up to the level, the age group that you're supposed to be at. Now, Thurman is the U.S. guy. He's going to take the Binet test, and he takes the test, and he calls it the